Hello and welcome to the FinTech Finance Virtual Arena. And today we've got a very special arena because we're going to be talking about payments in general and really the impact PSD2 and a post 3DS world really is going to have on payments. And joining me, I have some absolutely brilliant experts in the field. And first up, I have Caroline Birchnell from Visa. Caroline, how are you doing here today?
Yeah, hi Doug. Yeah, good, thank you. Very good.
Excellent. And could you, for our viewers, could you give a bit of background to your role at Visa, please?
Yeah, sure. So I lead the authentication team at Visa. And as you can imagine, we're very busy people at the moment. There's a lot going on with SCA regulation having taken effect across most of Europe on the 1st of January. We have UK, obviously, going live on the 14th of September. So we've been working really hard to get everything ready. And it's just been a very exciting journey. So yeah, that's me. And it's nice to meet you all and great to take part in this discussion. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much. And also we have Noam Grinberg from Nuvi. Noam, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you very much. So I'm Noam, I'm a VP Risk in Nuvi. So part of the things that we are doing in our risk team, we are also responsible on all this optimization and the monitoring of the PSD2, to keep the conversion high for the merchants and of course to still stay compliant. So we are also very busy in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 months with all these changes and configurations and optimizations. So thank you for inviting me as well.
Right, well, thank you very much, Noam. And last but not least, we have Shani-Michel from Forza Gallery. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing well, thank you, and nice to be here. I'm Galit, I'm VP Payment at Forza. I'm responsible at Forza for everything that has to do with payment optimization and basically ensuring that legitimate transactions are going through successfully. And of course, under everything happening with PSD2, this is our main focus at the moment, basically to know what is the right thing to do with every transaction, whether to 3DS or to do an exemption, which one, just to ensure that the PSD2 is not harming the conversion for our merchants.
Brilliant. Well, I think from what you've all said to me just now, it's very apparent that the payments industry as a whole is going through a wealth of changes because of the regulations in place and especially around authentication. So with that in mind, we're seeing especially in Europe, the requirement to apply 3D secure or 3DS to an increasingly large number of transactions. So Caroline, could I come to you first? What impact is 3DS having and what trends do you think we're going to be seeing from the first couple of months post-enforcement?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Doug, EMV 3DS is relatively new out there in the ecosystem. We've been working really hard with all of our clients, issuers, acquirers, merchants, gateways, technology providers to have the new version up and running and deployed as widely as possible. Clearly, there are a lot of different parties that need to come together to make this happen. And as you know, Visa don't actually do issuing cards. We don't actually accept the payments. We rely upon our partners, our clients, issuers, acquirers, gateways to do all that for us. And so trying to actually make change happen in a relatively short space of time is always challenging, and banks don't like moving quickly. Everybody wants to make sure that things happen smoothly and there are no teething problems. And clearly in the middle of a global pandemic, we never anticipated we would have this to deal with as well. So that said, we're making excellent progress. We now have more than 90% of all e-com enabled for EMV 3DS. So it's fantastic progress. And obviously EMV 3DS brings some significant benefits to the ecosystem. So it enables the use of mobile and other devices. There's lots of data for risk-based decisioning. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there's some really, really big benefits that the regulation has helped us to accelerate and bring to the ecosystem. So what we've been doing at Visa is trying to provide the right support, the insight, the infrastructure that the whole ecosystem needs to be able to make that happen. So yes, it's been a very busy time, but I would say a lot has been achieved in a relatively short space of time.
Yeah, it really has. The pace of change has just absolutely ramped up, and I think that's important to touch on is that partnership element. And I want to also ask then, Galit, your perspective when it comes to a kind of post 3D secure environment. What trends are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, so I really agree with Caroline here. We see the really big change that happened in the ecosystem, and we are really happy with it, with more and more issuers being more and more ready with the 3DS2, which obviously works better than 3DS1. What we are still seeing is that the 3DS has a very big effect on the conversion, even when it comes to 3DS2. The performance of the mobile, I think, maybe is the most like the biggest problem at the moment. The way that it works in the mobile app cause a lot of failures in the 3DS still. Sometimes I think it's just consumer not even realizing that they have to deal with the window. They think they finished the purchase process and they just miss the window, or they don't see it properly on their device. We still see in general about 20 to 30% failure when sending transaction to 3DS. In general, obviously some countries like the UK, even though it's not, the PSD2 is not activated there at the moment, but obviously in the UK it's much, much better. In the Norwegian countries, it's working very well. Some countries like Italy, we still see that the 3DS is creating a negative effect on the conversion. And I think as time goes by, the consumers will get better at it, the issuers will get better at it, and from the product side, I really, really hope that the product for the mobile will actually become better, and I think it will help a lot.
Interesting. Now, speaking of that product and hearing about that friction, Noam, I always, in my mind, PSD2 was meant to remove that friction. Why are we seeing so many false declines here?
Yeah, I think it's a bit confusing when you think to remove the friction, because the basic of all the PSD2, it's like to make everything more secure, and making everything more secure, it's sending much more transaction for authentication. So by definition, once you have another level of authentication, it's reducing conversion. Like what we are very busy, and also the product and Visa, MasterCard, is to first of all to use the exemption as much as possible, and we see that the exemption are giving very good performance. We see that it's going frictionless, like in very high percentage. Of course, that there is difference between location, but in general, we see that it's working. This is the way to go. And also in the 3D Secure 2, we see the difference between the issuers. Like you see all the fintech companies that you can just, give confirmation for the payment through the application. You see very high, almost no change in the conversion. And maybe with the 3D Secure 2.2, when they will be able also to do the biometric authentication to get better. So for the short term, there is impact for the cardholder, for the merchant. We're already trying to find the best way. But for the long term, I think that everybody will get used to. Also, from the technology point of view, they will have better authentication flow. And hopefully, once everything will be more secure, also the issuers will remove a lot of restriction from their side, so we'll get higher approval ratio. So for the long term, I'm very optimistic. For the short term, it's a challenge. I must say here also, it's good to check, many times the merchants are concerned because they see that the authentication was, many abandoned transactions. But when you're checking it by a unique user, you see sometimes they are not able to authenticate themselves on the first attempt. But when you're checking by user, suddenly you are getting to 90%, 93, 95, that many of them are able to complete it in the second and third attempts. And again, we need also, it's like to educate the market. But for now, for sure, it's a challenge. We are monitoring on a daily basis on the different behavior on the issuers per merchant and trying to optimize.
Interesting. Well, Caroline, if I could pass the question on to you then, are you seeing any macro trends that of consumers trying to deal with the increased maybe authentication obstacles that come from 3DS2, and maybe even trying to get around some of the conversion issues that they're having?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Noma's very kind of clearly articulated that as well, that it does take time for new things to bed in. Consumers, when you ask consumers to do something different, That always takes a little bit of time for all of us to get used to different things. And clearly what we want consumers to do is to download mobile apps, to be able to update their mobile numbers. All banks are working really hard to do big communication campaigns to make sure that their cardholders are very, very aware of everything they need to do. But clearly, occasionally there are times when it doesn't work well first time. But I do agree with Noam that generally speaking, it does, things do go well. And we don't see abandonment rates as high as those described by Galit. Across Europe, the average is quite significantly lower than that. But I think it's important to say that, of course, it does vary a lot depending on the use case, and merchants themselves can do an awful lot to improve their chances of transactions being authenticated. So cardholders are used to shopping online now, all of us do, and very quickly are adapting to the new ways of doing things. But from a merchant's perspective, I think it's really important, and I know that the banks and the gateways generally are working really hard to get the message out, that when they do send transactions through, they must use 3D Secure if they have to do so for regulatory purposes. So it's really important that they inform themselves really well about exemptions, transactions which are out of scope, times when they don't necessarily need to do 3D Secure, and take advantage of those opportunities. But where they do need to do 3D Secure, where the regulation requires it, then the best thing they can do is to make sure that they're sending through all the data. So for in-app purchases, as Galit said, those have at times been a little bit more complex, and certainly it's a new thing for issuers to get to grips with. The more that they kind of make sure that they pay attention to the technical details and sending the true transactions correctly, the greater likelihood there is that those transactions will pass without any kind of friction. So I think things are moving in the right direction. One of the things that we've definitely noticed is in the kind of early days of January, it was made very clear, a lot of regulators very much kind of like took on board the fact that there was a lot to take on for consumers, for everybody in January in this pandemic situation we were all in, and have provided a little bit of extra time for the whole ecosystem to ramp up. So in many markets, the regulation hasn't 100% gone live yet. There's a little bit of a lag in some cases, which has given everybody time to test, to kind of get themselves up to speed with it in a kind of more steady and managed way. And so for that reason, we haven't seen, wide scale disruption. On the contrary, it's been a kind of steady move in the right direction. And yeah, I do think consumers do appreciate the value that payments with cards are clearly very secure and very, very easy to use, and have been, the main way to pay online for many, many years. So I think, yes, things are definitely moving in the right direction, but it's of course natural that there will be some disruption as change happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I can completely imagine. That must almost be just such a massive headache. With so much change, you then have to wait for every part of the ecosystem to catch up. Now, Galit, if I could throw the same question to you as well then. When it comes to consumers dealing with this change in authentication, are you noticing any different trends from the consumer side of things handling with this new authentication and dealing with fraud?
Yes, so I think very big challenge here is really related to the pandemic and to the fact that a lot of these users are new to online. It's true that it's been a year that they have been online, but some of them, it took them more time. So for someone that is new to online and suddenly they have another thing that they need to do when they do the purchase, and sometimes it takes them more time, some population to go and to get this SMS code. And by the time they type it, sometimes they get like a timeout. So I think it's really also related to that. And the users are getting used to it. I also agree with what Noam said about how to measure it. It's really, really critical. We are helping a lot of our merchants with the right reporting and how to measure it according to the intent to purchase, and not just on the transaction level, because a lot of them actually trying a few times. I think they want to see if they will still run into the 3DS authentication window when they try again and again. And the third time they run into it, they understand they have to complete it, and then they actually do. And yes, then next time they will do it. So what we see is that by the time they get used to it, they are doing it properly. And but on the other hand, some of them that are dropping are dropping, and this is a problem. I agree that it's a lot about the merchant training and explaining to their consumers what they need to do, and letting their consumers know there is a new regulation and they need to authenticate, and it's in their favor. At the same time, I agree with Noam, it's super critical to use the exemptions and to know when it's the right thing to avoid the authentication, especially for the low risk transaction. Especially we are in favor of the TRA. Being a fraud vendor, if we know the transaction is very low risk and we know the user and legally it's allowed to avoid the 3DS, we recommend to avoid the 3DS, and we see that the success rate of these exemptions is very good. I'm actually very happy with the issuers reacting well to the exemption request. So I think this is also very important because it shows that the whole regulation and the system, it's getting there. It's starting to work. It's reacting in the right direction. And for me, the right way really to do it is to authenticate in cases that authentication is important, and to really do the TRA exemption and other kind of exemption when you know the user and you just want to let him have a frictionless experience.
Interesting. And yeah, creating that frictionless experience has been really e-commerce's main goal for a number of years. And now we're going to be hearing about SCA. So, and with that in mind, Noam, I'm going to come to you in a second, but Caroline has already mentioned that she's been working on it. So Caroline, with so many customers now embracing e-commerce, especially in the wake of the pandemic, what could SCA potentially do to this customer frictionless experience and the conversion rates?
Yeah, no, definitely. So SCA, of course, is designed to reduce fraud. And for that reason, in order to do so, there has to be a certain amount of friction in the purchase flow for transactions that are deemed to be potentially high risk, or where the regulation identifies that they need to happen. That's a natural thing. But you're right, Doug. I mean, we're definitely seeing here in Europe, for example, we're seeing the proportion of merchants selling online for the first time. It's increased from 27% to 43% since June 2020. So there's been a huge increase in new merchants entering digital payments for the first time. And they're entering at a time when lots of disruption and change is happening. So hence a lot of the work we've been doing to raise awareness amongst merchants of all that they need to do and informing themselves really well. So what impact could SCA have? We actually have done some modelling, and we believe that the current levels of EMV 3DS usage actually shouldn't increase an enormous amount more, because if as a merchant you are able to take advantage of the exemptions and you flag out of scope transactions correctly, then what you're left with are the transactions that typically you probably would have put through EMV 3DS anyway. So what we are seeing, though, that's really interesting is new entrants, so new big digital players who are using EMV 3DS for the first time. And we see in markets such as the UK, where things are very well established and going very well, that abandonment rates are down as low as 2%. So the system works very well. And we're seeing some of the really big digital merchants opting to use EMV 3DS widely in the UK before they even have to from a regulatory point of view. So I think really all that the regulation is doing is, I don't think in and of itself, it needs to result in a huge spike in the amount of EMV 3DS transactions, because as I say, if you use the exemptions and out of scope transactions, that shouldn't happen. But what it is doing is encouraging everybody to adopt things like biometrics. So there's been a much wider deployment of biometrics by the banks, more consumers using biometric authentication, which is a great thing. We're seeing more banks adopting risk-based authentication, so trusting data for risk-based decisioning. So what it's done is to just accelerate the deployment of some of these new technologies. And this is a great thing. It's a great thing for consumers because it means that their payments are more secure and low friction when things work as they should. It's a great thing for merchants because certainly if merchants use EMV 3DS, they generally receive liability protection, which is something that's very, very good for them when they do the right thing. And it also means that the friction, that the transaction itself is very low friction. So I think all of these things are contributing towards not as huge a change once the SCA regulation takes full effect, as you would actually expect. But in order for that to happen, it means that everybody needs to play their parts and do the right thing. And that means really informing themselves of everything that they need to do.
Brilliant. And well, it seems like a hard task to create that education, but a natural one that will go ahead. Like Galit said, maybe by the third time we will have got to that point when we make that transaction. Now, Noam, could I also throw the question to you now as well? With customers now embracing e-commerce as well, from Nuvi's perspective, what are you seeing from SCA and conversion rates?
So it's more or less the same. Like we see that the authentication, we said it's reducing some of the conversion, but we are doing some things to keep the conversion. So first of all, just to add to what Caroline said, we are really looking forward that the 3D Secure 2.2 will be more widespread. And then we will start issuers and merchants, and we'll be able to start with the whitelisting. And I believe that this will be huge impact for all the merchants that have like repeat users that are doing multiple transactions. So this needs to reduce the friction a lot. It's, I think, one of the best tools, but it's still not widespread. So this is something that we are really looking forward. And as we said, with the time, it will get better. More things that we are doing in order to keep the conversion high. So first of all, we think that it's better to ask the exemption, first of all, in straight authorization, instead of going through the 3D Secure, to go straight authorization. And in case of getting a soft decline, then we are doing automatic reattempt to 3D Secure. This again to keep the conversion, to keep the things as simple as possible. Another thing that we are doing, because in 3D Secure 2, it's new for everyone, and there are some technical problems in different sites. So if we see that the 3D Secure 2 is failing from some technical reason, automatically we are downgrading to 3D Secure 1. Okay, so again to keep the transaction as much as possible. And again, we are doing the maximum that is possible to make sure that we are not missing any transaction that is out of scope, to make sure that everything is being flagged correctly. So things that are out of scope, not, if it's MIT and one-leg transaction and anonymous cards, so that all of these things really will stay out of the strong customer authentication. And again, with the strong customer authentication, as I said, another thing that we are doing, it's optimization by the 3D Secure version. So yes, we are getting response, what is the issue, what kind of version they are supporting, but we are comparing the performance between 3D Secure 2 and 3D Secure 1 per issue. And if we see specific issues that have significantly bad performance in 3D Secure 2 because it's new and they need to adjust and everything, so we are still keeping the transaction 3D Secure 1. So these are many actions that we are taking on our side in monitoring in order to keep the conversion out of the CA.
Interesting. Now, with that in mind, Galit, if I could come to you then, and we've kind of been touching on it generally throughout the conversation, but can I ask, what do you think 3DS2 will do for the industry going forward? As Noam said, there are elements where sometimes the industry looks to the previous model. What's 3DS2 going to go on to do in the future?
Yeah, so I think in general 3DS2 works better, and when 3DS 2.2 will come, as Noam said, when whitelisting will work better, if and when delegated authentication will be part of all of this, and when the exemptions will work via the 3DS 2.2. I think it will, if it will work as it should, it will really allow us to try to do the exemption, try to pass exemption when we believe it's the right thing, and get the real answer from the issuer if they can agree to it or not. And if they want the authentication, we can continue to authentication. So I basically think it will create a better view of all party of what everyone is expecting to see, rather than what is happening today, which is sending it to authorization, and if there is a soft decline, doing the authentication. We still see a lot of issuers not responding with a soft decline. More and more are responding with a soft decline, like every day it's getting better. But we still see declines that are not a soft decline. When we try with 3DS, it still solves the problem. So I would like to see issuers more like replying accurately with the soft decline. When the 3DS 2.2 will be supported among all the issuers, we will really be able to try to pass the TRA exemption in the right place via the rails and give them what they are looking for. I think in general, what I still don't see enough around is the usage of exemption. We still see a lot of merchants that really think that PSD2 is about sending everything to 3DS and not understanding the relationship, which is very, very important, between having a very good fraud vendor or managing their fraud in a very, very good way and avoiding the 3DS when it's a good idea to avoid it and when the transactions are low risk, and allowing their very good users not to go through authentication, or at least not to go through authentication every time. This is like the relationship, which to me is very obvious, but I still see around that people look at 3DS, like at PSD2 as like, this is a regulatory requirement. There is PSD2, we need to 3DS all of our transactions. And I don't think this is what it was meant for. And this creates, I think, too much friction into what you described before correctly as we've been doing e-commerce for so many years, working to get it like frictionless experience. And suddenly a lot of the consumers are actually getting an experience which is not really the best one. So this is like where I would like to see the ecosystem going, and the merchant understanding that it's all about managing your fraud properly, managing the risk, and understanding when authentication is a good idea and should be done, and it's helpful and it's amazing, and when they should leverage the exemptions and make sure that, or the whitelisting or all the other things, to ensure that they are providing the best experience to their consumers.
Interesting. And Caroline, can I ask, do you agree with Galit there that it will be exemptions that will be critical to the e-commerce industry going forward? Does that resonate with you too?
Absolutely, it does. Noam also mentioned the trusted beneficiary exemption. We're seeing some really great solutions coming through now into the ecosystem where that's starting to really take off. So that's a very, very interesting one, because obviously a lot of us are creatures of habit as consumers, and genuinely, if you're generally shopping at a merchant frequently, particularly a merchant that is low risk, there's no reason why your bank shouldn't be happy to put that merchant onto a trusted beneficiary list. So that's an interesting development. It's not been rolled out so widely yet, because obviously initially the push from everybody was just to get the kind of like EMV3DS, the exemption flagging, all of the out of scope flagging, all of that over the line first. That's been the priority. But I think from now on, you'll start to see a lot more of those trusted beneficiary solutions rolling out. And we look forward to seeing more of those, and certainly doing everything we can to support the ecosystem in making that happen. The other thing that Noah mentioned, which is very important, I think, as well, is the whole concept of delegation. So this is a very interesting new concept. It's still relatively new, which is the idea that merchants or third parties could take responsibility for authentication. So today we're very familiar with EMV3DS, where authentication is undertaken by the issuer, but actually Visa has some great solutions where that authentication could be taken on by the merchant themselves or by a token requester, such as one of the XPays, or in fact a mobile wallet, as we've seen as well sometimes in some of the Nordic markets. That's quite popular. And the great thing about this is that often a merchant or a third party knows their customers really, really well, and is in a great situation, particularly with things like mobile wallets, where they're using biometrics to authenticate the customer, to take responsibility for that, and then simply just to pass on a message to the issuer to say, hey, we've done this on your behalf. Visa sits in the middle and makes sure that obviously rules are followed, standards are maintained, the fraud is kept low. We sit right in the middle as kind of the policeman, if you like, to make sure that the whole system can be trusted. And then that gives the issuer comfort that everything has been done according to the regulation, and they don't now need to go through that step up and that challenge process themselves. So we expect to see more of that coming. And I think there's some very exciting new developments, some new technologies available around FIDO, certainly that are emerging, and we really look forward to seeing that develop as well. So it's not only EMV3DS, which is the path to authentication, there's alternatives as well, because ultimately what we all want is the same thing. We want the system to work as it should, and genuinely, like anything, the best way for the system to work as well as it should is for people to have options. And as I say, as Visa, we sit right in the middle, the way the system works, and we make sure that standards are maintained and that everything works as it should. So yes, there's lots of interesting things around delegation.
Yeah, I completely agree. Delegation and really the changing risk and responsibility on all the different parties within the ecosystem, because the technology, because the regulations are changing, I think that is going to change, like you said, Caroline, there. So just to wrap up, because I believe we are running out of time, Noam, we've talked about e-commerce hitting its stride because of the pandemic, and merchants obviously sit at the very heart of this whole revolution effectively in payments. What would you say to merchants who are concerned about losing revenue due to some of these increased authentication measures?
So I'm saying that you don't need to worry so much, because actually we see the numbers. We see that if we are talking about the revenue point of view, I can say that we almost don't see any reduction. Like in the end of the day, I leave approval ratio, conversion, like we are talking about dollars, the payments, the sales, we almost don't see any drop. Even we see increase, like in general things are increasing, but almost any drop. So what I would say to the merchant, again, just to use the maximum, the exemptions, to choose a provider that is really have a flexible solution. Okay, so we can do this, this routing, the reattempt, to do the TRA, to be able to do the transaction risk analysis, and to be able to optimize, to be able to do, all the different flexibility between 3D, non-3D, 3D version, to be able to offer 3D Secure 2.2 with all the additional products, like really to be ahead of the things. So at the end of the day, we see that we don't see big impact. Again, if you are using all these features and the exemptions and the reattempts, so it's not so bad how it sounds.
Well,
at the end of the day, when a card holder wants to make a purchase, so if it's very important for him, he will complete it. So he will need to contact his issuer again. I'm not saying that it's perfect. It's far from perfect, but it's keeping, like in the end of the day, the impact is not so big. It's manageable completely.
Yeah, it sounds from our discussion today that it's a constantly evolving evolution throughout what we're going to really see as a result of 3DS2 and other models coming forward from around payments. So guys, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolutely insightful discussion, and to all our viewers for watching. You can catch the rest of the series and much more over at www.fintechf.com, and of course YouTube and LinkedIn. So I'll see you then, and goodbye.